My name is Tony Ferris, and this is a proposal for a study on compassion fatigue and self-care related to conflict resolution facilitators. When we talk about compassion fatigue and self-care, we first have to define compassion fatigue. It is a situation where a person working with people who are in conflict or in conflict situations find themselves depleted physically, mentally, or spiritually, and continue to extend themselves. This is a little bit different from burnout. Burnout is a situation in which the practitioner will withdraw. I think there's probably some crossover in those situations. People might flip back and forth. On the other end of the spectrum, a more serious condition would be vicarious trauma, in which the practitioner is traumatized by hearing the stories or seeing conflict happening. There are some ethical considerations with working with people in trauma, so for this study I'd like to really stick with compassion fatigue. To do that, I'm going to limit my sample to working with people who have limited exposure, and we'll talk about that later in the presentation. We also have to define self-care, and this is there isn't a consensus on whether or not people in our field experience compassion fatigue, and there's less consensus on what would be good self-care techniques. I think part of this might be because self-care is so personal, and also because it just doesn't seem to be a focus for our field and the well-being or caring for the caregivers, right? So some suggestions were reflective practice, social support like supervision and peer coaching. Mindfulness was presented. Spirituality and prayer have been written about. Another technique that I thought was pretty interesting is vicarious resilience, and this would be focusing on the resilience of the people that we're working with rather than their trauma. And the last one is compassion training, which is a meditation technique grounded in compassionate, loving meditation. So my research question is, do conflict resolution practitioners experience compassion fatigue? And I open that up to stress related to facilitation. In this way, I have some flexibility to make those definitions. And what self-care techniques are practitioners currently using to prevent or recover from compassion fatigue in the field? So I wanted to pick a grounded theory because there are so many variables related to what people think compassion fatigue might mean for them, what situations might unfold when they're in the field, and what kind of self-care techniques they might consciously or subconsciously be using. To understand what people are experiencing, I wanted to use a narrative method to ask the questions, how were their experiences in the field, so that I can maybe use a deductive analysis to have them, through narrative, link the experiences of being in the conflict setting to the things that they're doing for their own personal self-care. And maybe even if they're not thinking that that's an intentional or conscious decision, maybe through the narrative form we can kind of uncover or generalize if those things are going on or not. My sample is relatively small because it's a narrative method. 3 participants from the Conflict Analysis and Resolution Study Abroad program at GMU, the CBRC. And I thought that we would meet via Zoom because of the current climate with COVID, and also because then it's easy to record the narrative session and then subsequently transcribe it for better analysis. So for the analysis, I would say that this is an episodic interview. I'm asking about a limited time period. A study abroad program is typically 1 to 2 weeks. I chose that because that limits the chance that someone might have had vicarious trauma because it's such a short period of time, and also because study abroad students are not in a position of responsibility. They're primarily there to learn. So it's not an immersive process like extended field work might be. The episodic interview would be recorded and transcribed via Zoom, And then the content would be coded for emerging themes related to compassion fatigue and self-care, using a deductive analysis. So I'm not locked into specific codes if someone is using a self-care technique that I hadn't thought of yet, or describes their compassion fatigue in a way that might not have been easy to decide ahead of time. I have some flexibility with trying to find information that maybe I didn't anticipate. The implications for the study are important. There are some ethical issues as people engage in this line of questioning. I think it's important that we're careful not to work with people who have had vicarious trauma, and in an effort not to re-traumatize them, especially without oversight. So that's one of the limitations of this study, is that there's such a small sample size, and we're working with people who have such a limited conflict exposure. As those limitations fall away in expansion of the topic, I think there would be more ethical issues. In the end, what I want to get out of it is maybe a wider acknowledgement in the field that there is such a thing as compassion fatigue related to conflict work, and a potential accumulation of self-care techniques, so that those could be incorporated in our training and education of conflict resolution facilitators, and maybe even included in project designs, so that there's time for self-care during the work period, or maybe if some of the modalities are available for conflict resolution practitioners in the field, it may limit burnout or this type of fatigue. And if we eventually got there, maybe these could be included in best practices for our field work. I look forward to your comments and questions about this topic. It has been really interesting for me, and I appreciate everyone's contributions to the class.